Environmental migrant refers to people who are forced to migrate from or flee their home region due to sudden or long-term changes to their local environment, which compromise their well-being or secure livelihood. Such changes are held to include increased droughts, desertification, sea level rise, and disruption of seasonal weather patterns such as monsoons. Environmental migrants may flee to or migrate to another country, or they may migrate internally within their own country. However, the term environmental migrant is used somewhat interchangeably with a range of similar terms, such as environmental refugee, climate migrant, although the distinction between these terms is contested. Despite problems in formulating a uniform and clear-cut definition of environmental migration, such a concept has increased as an issue of concern in the 2000s as policymakers, environmental and social scientists attempt to conceptualize the potential societal effects of climate change and general environmental degradation. Definition and concept. The term environmental refugee was first proposed by Lester Brown in 1976. Since then there has been a proliferation in the use of the term, at which environmental migrant, and a cluster of similar categories, including forced environmental migrant, environmentally motivated migrant, climate refugee, climate change refugee, environmentally displaced person, disaster refugee, environmental displacee, eco-refugee, ecologically displaced person, and environmental refugee have been utilized. The differences between these terms are less important than what they have in common. They all suggest that there is a determinable relationship between environmental drivers and human migration, which is analytically useful, policy relevant, and possibly grounds for the expansion of refugee law. Under the United Nations Convention relating to the status of refugees of 1951, a refugee is more narrowly defined as a person who, owing to a well-founded fear of being persecuted for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group, or political opinion, is outside the country of his nationality, and is unable to, or, owing to such fear, is unwilling to avail himself of the protection of that country. While the concept of a refugee was expanded by the Convention's 1967 protocol and by regional conventions in Africa and Latin America to include persons who had fled war or other violence in their home country. In its present state, the Convention does not provide long-term legal protection to refugees due to environmental change. The International Organization for Migration proposes the following definition for environmental migrants. Environmental migrants are persons or groups of persons who, for compelling reasons of sudden or progressive changes in the environment that adversely affect their lives or living conditions, are obliged to leave their habitual homes, or choose to do so, either temporarily or permanently, and who move either within their country or abroad. The term climate refugees refers to the subset of environmental migrants forced to move due to sudden or gradual alterations in the natural environment related to at least one of three impacts of climate change: sea level rise, extreme weather events, and drought and water scarcity. However, there is yet to be a universally accepted definition of environmental migration, or climate refugee. Thus, the International Organization for Migration formulated a working definition which encompasses the complexity of the topic. This working definition recognizes that environmental migrants are not only those displaced by the environmental event but also those whose migration is triggered by deteriorating environmental conditions. Environmentally induced movement can take place within as well as across international borders. It can be both long and short-term, and population movements triggered by environmental forces can be forced as well as a matter of choice. Types. The International Organization for Migration proposes three types of environmental migrants. Environmental emergency migrants. People who flee temporarily due to an environmental disaster or sudden environmental event. Environmental forced migrants. people who have to leave due to deteriorating environmental conditions. Environmental motivated migrants, also known as environmentally induced economic migrants, people who choose to leave to avoid possible future problems. Enumeration. There have been a number of attempts over the decades to enumerate environmental migrants and refugees. Jody Jacobson is cited as the first researcher to enumerate the issue, stating that there were already up to 10 million environmental refugees. Drawing on worst-case scenarios about sea level rise, she argued that all forms of environmental refugees would be 6 times as numerous as political refugees. By 1989, Mustafa Tolba, executive director of UNEP, was claiming that as many as 50 million people could become environmental refugees if the world did not act to support sustainable development. In 1990, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change declared that the greatest single consequence of climate change could be migration, with millions of people displaced by shoreline erosion, coastal flooding and severe drought. In the mid-1990s, British environmentalist Norman Myers became the most prominent proponent of this maximalist school, noting that environmental refugees will soon become the largest group of involuntary refugees. Additionally, he stated that there were 25 million environmental refugees in the mid-1990s, further claiming that this figure could double by 2010, with an upper limit of 200 million by 2050. Myers argued that the causes of environmental displacement would include desertification, lack of water, salination of irrigated lands and the depletion of biodiversity. He also hypothesized that displacement would amount to 30 meters in China, 30 meters in India, 15 meters in Bangladesh, 14 meters in Egypt, 10 meters in other delta areas and coastal zones, 1 meter in island states, and with otherwise agriculturally displaced people totaling 50 meters by 2050. More recently, Myers has suggested that the figure by 2050 might be as high as 250 million. Variations of this claim have been made in influential reports on climate change by the IPCC and the Stern Review on the Economics of Climate Change, as well as by NGOs such as Friends of the Earth, Greenpeace Germany and Christian Aid, and intergovernmental organizations such as the Council of Europe, UNESCO, IOM and UNHCR. Norman Myers is perhaps the most widely cited, and the authority of his claims is often attributed to the fact that his chief contribution to the field, and which came to a total of 25 million environmental migrants in 1995, used over 1,000 sources. Vikram Kolmaskog has stated that Myers' work can be criticized for being inconsistent, impossible to check and failing to take proper account of opportunities to adapt. Furthermore, Myers himself has acknowledged that his figures are based upon heroic extrapolation. More generally, Black has argued that there is surprisingly little scientific evidence that indicates that the world is filling up with environmental refugees. Indeed, François Gemena has stated that, when it comes to predictions, figures are usually based on the number of people living in regions at risk, and not on the number of people actually expected to migrate. Estimates do not account for adaptation strategies, or different levels of vulnerability. Asia and the Pacific. According to the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center, more than 42 million people were displaced in Asia and the Pacific during 2010 and 2011, more than twice the population of Sri Lanka. This figure includes those displaced by storms, floods, and heat and cold waves. Still others were displaced by drought and sea level rise. Most of those compelled to leave their homes eventually returned when conditions improved, but an undetermined number became migrants, usually within their country, but also across national borders. Climate-induced migration is a highly complex issue which needs to be understood as part of global migration dynamics. Migration typically has multiple causes, and environmental factors are intertwined with other social and economic factors. which themselves can be influenced by environmental changes. Environmental migration should not be treated solely as a discrete category, set apart from other migration flows. A 2012 Asian Development Bank study argues that climate-induced migration should be addressed as a part of a country's development agenda, given the major implications of migration on economic and social development. The report recommends interventions both to address the situation of those who have migrated, as well as those who remain in areas subject to environmental risk. It says, to reduce migration compelled by worsening environmental conditions, and to strengthen resilience of at-risk communities, governments should adopt policies and commit financing to social protection, livelihoods development, basic urban infrastructure development, and disaster risk management. Additionally, it is maintained that the poor populate areas that are most at risk for environmental destruction and climate change, including coastlines, floodlines and steep slopes. As a result, climate change threatens areas already suffering from extreme poverty. The issue of equity is crucial. Climate affects us all, but does not affect us all equally, UN Secretary-General Ban Ki-moon told delegates at a climate conference in Indonesia. In Minkan County, Gansu Province, 10,000 people have left the area and have become Shengtai Yimin, ecological migrants. In 2013, a claim of a Kiribati man of being a climate change refugee under the Convention relating to the status of refugees was determined by the New Zealand High Court to be untenable. The Refugee Convention did not apply as there is no persecution or serious harm related to any of the 5 stipulated convention grounds. The court rejected the argument that the international community itself were the persecutor for the purposes of the Refugee Convention. This analysis of the need for the person to identify persecution of the type described in the Refugee Convention does not exclude the possibility that a people for countries experiencing severe impacts of climate change can come with the Refugee Convention. However, it is not the climate change event itself, rather the social and political response to climate change, which is likely to create the pathway for a successful claim. The New Zealand Immigration and Protection Tribunal and the High Court. There is a complex interrelationship between natural disasters, environmental degradation and human vulnerability. Sometimes a tenable pathway to international protection under the Refugee Convention can result. Environmental issues sometimes lead to armed conflict. There may be ensuing violence towards or direct repression of an entire section of a population. Humanitarian relief can become politicized, particularly in situations where some group inside a disadvantaged country is the target of direct discrimination. The New Zealand Court of Appeal also rejected the claim in a 2014 decision. On further appeal, the New Zealand Supreme Court confirmed the earlier adverse rulings against the application for refugee status, with the Supreme Court also rejecting the proposition that environmental degradation resulting from climate change or other natural disasters could never create a pathway into the Refugee Convention or protected person jurisdiction. In 2014, attention was drawn to an appeal to the New Zealand Immigration and Protection Tribunal against the deportation of a Tuvaluan family on the basis that they were climate change refugees who would suffer hardship resulting from the environmental degradation of Tuvalu. However, the subsequent grant of residence permits to the family was made on grounds unrelated to the refugee claim. The family was successful in their appeal because, under the relevant immigration legislation, there were exceptional circumstances of a humanitarian nature that justified the grant of resident permits as the family was integrated into New Zealand society with a sizable extended family which had effectively relocated to New Zealand. Political and legal perspectives. The International Organization for Migration expects the scale of global migration to rise as a result of accelerated climate change. It therefore recommends policymakers around the world take a proactive stance on the matter. The IOM is composed of 146 member states and 13 observer states and works closely with governments in promoting migration management that ensures humane and orderly migration that is beneficial to migrants and societies. Additionally, when interviewing Oliver Smith, an anthropologist and member of the UN group, National Geographic magazine noted that there are at least 20 million environmental refugees worldwide. The UN group says more than those displaced by war and political repression combined. Therefore, it is imperative that we begin to recognize this recent division of refugee. The Environmental Justice Foundation has argued that the people who will be forced to move due to climate change currently have no adequate recognition in international law. The EJF contends that a new multilateral legal instrument is required to specifically address the needs of climate refugees in order to confer protection to those fleeing environmental degradation and climate change. They have also asserted that additional funding is needed to enable developing countries to adapt to climate change. Sujatha Bhairavan and Sudhir Chalarajan have argued for the use of the term climate exiles and for international agreements to provide them political and legal rights, including citizenship in other countries, bearing in mind those countries' responsibilities and capabilities. In some cases, climate change may lead to conflict arising between countries that as a result of flooding or other conditions produce a large number of refugees, and bordering countries that build fences to keep out these refugees. The Bangladesh-India border is largely separated via a fence, and case studies suggest the possibility of island conflict arising due to people fleeing from areas suffering from destruction of arable land. Current migration has already resulted in low-scale conflicts. Popular culture. The notion of environmental migrant, and particularly climate refugee, has gained traction in popular culture. A documentary entitled Climate Refugees has been released. Climate Refugees is an official selection for the 2010 Sundance Film Festival. More recently, short documentary Academy Award nominee Sun Come Up tells the story of Carteret Islanders who are forced to leave their ancestral land in response to climate change and migrate to war-torn Bougainville. Since 2007, German artist Hermann Joseph Hack has shown his World Climate Refugee Camp in the centers of various European cities. The model camp, made of roughly 1,000 miniature tents, is a public art intervention that depicts the social impacts of climate change. Documentary films. Climate Refugees, documentary movie directed by Michael P. Nash, starring Lester Brown, Y.V. Oderburg, Paul Ehrlich. Eco-Migrants. The Case of Bowler Island, documentary movie directed by Susan Stein, starring Katherine Jacobson, Nancy Schneider, Bogomil Terminsky. Refugees of the Blue Planet, documentary movie directed by Eileen Choquette and Jean-Philippe Duval.